Thomas Bernhard's Trilogy of the Arts. Following the cataclysmic nightmare of the Second World War, a few countries, for obvious reasons, had more soul-searching to do than Germany and Austria. For the remainder of the 20th century and up until the present day, the writers and artists of these nations have tried to make sense of where their countrymen went wrong, and have wrestled with the enormously difficult task of moving on. While writers like Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass achieved great popular success constructing epic narratives set in the past as a means of examining it, another writer, lesser read, wildly controversial, but lavishly praised in his own right, pushed the limits of using literature to explore a distinctly modern version of post-war anxiety and malaise known as Weltschmerz. This writer was the Austrian novelist, poet, and playwright Thomas Bernhard. Please sit back and enjoy today's edition of Lit Tips. Bernhard's early life was nothing less than Dickensian. Born in the Netherlands in 1931 to a mother who worked as a maid, and a petty criminal of a father who never acknowledged his son, the young Bernhard moved to Bavaria in 1937 after his mother remarried and was forced, like all of his peers, to join the Hitler Youth. Even at this young age, he developed a hatred toward not just Nazism itself, but against the ignorant masses that had allowed it to seize hold of Germany in the first place. He never met his biological father, as he died from an assumed suicide by gas poisoning in 1940. The theme of suicide would play a role in nearly every one of Bernhard's works later on. Even after the end of the war, what would become a lifelong battle with a lung condition forced Bernhard into a life of partial social isolation. Despite this, his grandfather, the writer Johann Freundbichler, encouraged Bernhard's natural proclivity for the arts. Extended stays in sanitariums did little to alleviate his ailments, and after they derailed his ambitions as an actor, then as a singer, Bernhard entered into a career in crime journalism before devoting himself full-time to writing fiction. His interest in music and theater never waned, and he went on to explore these topics, along with that of painting, in 3 novels that make up an unofficial thematic trilogy. These novels are The Loser, Woodcutters, and Old Masters, a comedy. Stylistically, Bernhard's works are immediately identifiable by their unique formatting. Though he experimented with more conventional presentation in early novels like Frost, by the time he'd fully matured as a writer, he'd solidified a style all his own. His novels are presented in the form of monologues delivered in single, unbroken paragraphs that generally last around 200 pages. The archetypical Bernhard narrator is, if not a social outcast, someone who is able to put on a sociable facade in public but uses their monologue as a means of venting their innermost contempt for their surroundings, their peers, and themselves. A precedent for this type of storytelling and character can be found in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, a classic that, if you haven't already read it, I recommend checking out before starting with anything by Bernhard. Before going any further, I need to address a few concerns that I can only assume have cropped up so far. Why read something that, from the outside, sounds so joyless and maudlin? This is a perfectly valid complaint for anyone hearing about Bernhard's work indirectly. Critic Dale Peck, in a 2010 article for the New York Times, explains Bernhard's significance by placing him in a canon of alternative Western literature. Peck explains, broadly speaking, Western literature can be divided into 2 traditions. The first, what we might call the canonical or public, or more generously, the democratic tradition, finds its roots in ancient Greece, and traces a fairly straightforward line through Rome and the Renaissance, and the European colonization of the Americas and other parts of the world. This is a literature that measures itself in successive aesthetic innovations, in language that, however manipulated, finds its idiom in the vernacular rather than the orthodox, and in an increasingly representative cast of characters and behaviors. In other words, it encompasses about 99% of all books. In contrast to this is a tradition that, in lieu of offering a rational critique of the world they inhabit, features anti-heroes that simply hate or reject it, just as their creators, far from seeing literature as a tool for cultural or even individual salvation, write only to give voice to a sense of alienation from oneself, one's peers, and one's place in history. Works from this second category that Peck cites include colossally influential cornerstones of Western literature like Don Quixote, curious precursors to postmodernism like The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, the aforementioned Notes from the Underground, and the bulk of Bernhard's output. In spite of the often bileless, unpleasant nature of the narration of Bernhard's novels, there is a strange, undeniably enjoyable appeal in reading the work of a writer who truly, fearlessly, does not give a damn about whether he is liked by his readers or if they agree with his musings and opinions. And the best way to truly experience the emergence of this appeal is to go ahead and read Bernhard's books for yourself. You'll quickly come to the pleasantly surprising realization that, for an author who constantly deals with themes of isolation, loneliness, anxiety, death, war, and suicide, Bernhard is far and away one of the funniest writers out there. Try not to at least crack a smile at the grim observation of lines like, "We have to keep company with supposedly bad characters if we are able to survive and not succumb to mental atrophy. People of good characters, so-called, are the ones who end up boring us to death." Lawyers make nothing but confusion. A lawyer is an instrument of the devil. In general, he's a fiendish idiot, banking on the stupidity of people much more stupid than himself, and by God, he's always right. Rather than allowing his books to become mired in dread, nihilism, and angst, Bernhard merely gives a more acidic edge to the same challenges toward, and wholesale rejections of, societal norms used by his predecessors like Cervantes and Dostoevsky. A more contemporary example of this tradition in other media can be found in the much more overtly comic social scenarios of television shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm, which give us as viewers the opportunity to live vicariously through a protagonist who has no problem saying exactly what's on his mind in any given situation, while still being safe in the knowledge that we'll never have to deal with any of the consequences of his countless social faux pas. So with all of this in mind, where to begin with reading Bernhard? The Trilogy of the Arts is the ideal starting point, as it represents examples of some of Bernhard's most acclaimed and accessible work. The Loser details the reflections of a man as he remembers his years as a student at a music academy studying alongside the Canadian piano prodigy Glenn Gould, and another man who is unable to cope with the fact that his own talent isn't even a fraction of Gould's no matter how hard he tries. This perceived failure drives him to suicide, and following Gould's own death by natural causes, the narrator is left alone to make sense of the fate of his two friends. In Woodcutters, Bernhard does little to disguise that the narrator is a stand-in for himself. The novel is a venomous treatise against what he sees as the vapid, petty bourgeois posturings of members of the Vienna theater scene in the 1980s. Making equally little effort to hide the identities of the real figures he attacks, Bernhard dealt with severe backlash and a temporary ban on the book in Austria. Despite this, it eventually returned to shelves and became a bestseller abroad. Old Masters, a comedy, is told from the point of view of a man named Otzbacher, and follows him recounting the biography and opinions he has learned from his acquaintance Rieger, an 82-year-old music critic. Otzbacher describes Rieger as a man who has made a ritual of sitting in front of the same painting in a Vienna museum for several hours every other morning. Through Otzbacher, we learn of Rieger's contempt for various aspects of Viennese society, as well as for figures like philosopher Martin Heidegger. Bernhard succumbed to complications with his lungs in 1989. Fittingly, in one last act of disdain toward the public, his death was not widely announced until after his funeral had already taken place. His will stipulated that none of his unpublished work would see the light of day and that no further staging of his plays would be allowed in Austria. These conditions were annulled a decade later by his half-brother. One can't help but imagine the sort of stinging diatribe Bernhard might have unleashed to document this defiant act of non-compliance. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Lit Tips. Now, you're probably thinking, that was morbid. So if you need a palate cleanser, check out one of our other videos. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our page and leave a comment below to suggest any writers you'd like to see us examine in future episodes. Until next time, keep reading.